June 1943. The first major groups of German prisoners of war arrived on American soil. More than 150,000 would follow over the next 2 years. They came by ship and by rail, guarded but unharmed, crossing a nation that was already transforming itself into something the world had never seen, a superpower built on production. From the docks of New York to the rail yards of Texas, they looked out the windows and saw motion everywhere, factories running day and night, freight trains carrying tanks, trucks, and bombers across thousands of miles. By 1944, America was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, one Liberty ship every 3 days, and nearly half of the world's total war material. For many of the German soldiers, it was their first direct glimpse of a free nation united by work, a democracy that outproduced every dictatorship on earth. What they saw wasn't just wealth. It was willpower made visible. And in that moment, they understood, America hadn't just entered the war, it had transformed it. The Liberty ship SS John Ericsson cut through the Atlantic, carrying the first large wave of German prisoners of war to the United States. Most had been captured in North Africa after the fall of Rommel's Afrika Korps. They expected hardship, maybe hostility. What they found instead was order, and power on a scale they had never imagined. As they disembarked in New York and Norfolk, American guards stood watch, calm, disciplined, well-fed, and confident. The prisoners' boots hit the wooden piers as they looked around, cranes towering overhead, cargo ships loading ammunition, mountains of supplies stacked high along the harbor. The war had taken them far from home, but now they were standing inside the very engine that was changing it. The U.S. Army would eventually hold over 425,000 Axis prisoners, mostly Germans, spread across 700 camps in 46 states. The trains that carried them inland ran through landscapes of motion. Rail lines packed with freight cars, industrial plants glowing even at midnight, and cities alive with purpose. From the windows of troop trains, the POWs saw the real America, not the caricature they'd been told existed. They saw farms with tractors plowing endless fields, highways full of trucks, women in overalls walking to factories before sunrise. What they were witnessing wasn't chaos, it was coordination. One German officer reportedly remarked, "We saw more trucks in a single day in Texas than we had in our entire division in France." Another, writing later from a camp in Nebraska, noted that, everywhere there was movement, everything was clean, organized, efficient. It was like the country itself was at war, not just the army. By 1943, the United States was producing 96,000 planes a year, 8,000 tanks a month, and over 60,000 artillery pieces annually. The Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant alone turned out one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. Entire factories were designed for a single purpose, speed. For the prisoners, many of whom had lived under rationing and ruins, this was a different kind of power, not rooted in conquest, but in capacity. While cities in Europe burned, American cities built. While the Axis tightened its grip through fear, the United States expanded its strength through freedom and unity. In the camps, they were fed decently, treated under the Geneva Convention, and even given chances to work on farms and in factories under supervision. The irony wasn't lost on many. They had been part of a regime that promised domination through force, and now they were witnessing a democracy that achieved dominance through productivity. Historian Arnold Kramer, who interviewed many former German POWs, recorded countless accounts of astonishment. They could not believe, he wrote, that a nation of civilians, so diverse, so informal, could organize such efficiency without the whip of dictatorship. To them, America seemed to hum with invisible energy. There was pride in the smallest things, a mechanic wiping his hands after a 12-hour shift, a waitress serving coffee to a soldier, a teenager collecting scrap metal for the war drive. Every gesture, every effort, seemed part of a vast rhythm, an orchestra of freedom at work. By 1944, many POWs had been moved deep inland, to camps in Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest. The wide-open land and abundant food stunned them. "We saw no bomb damage, no shortages," one remembered. It was as if the war did not touch this country, except to make it stronger. What they didn't realize was that this abundance had been earned. Millions of Americans worked double shifts, families rationed meat, rubber, and gasoline, farmers increased output by half. Detroit alone produced more military equipment than all of Italy. The German prisoners had been told America was soft, addicted to comfort, incapable of sacrifice. What they found was the opposite. The United States had transformed its comfort into capability, its freedom into focus, its wealth into weapons. As trains rolled past endless fields and factories, one truth became undeniable: America's strength didn't come from empire or fear. It came from unity and faith in work itself. By the time those German prisoners settled into the camps, the lesson was clear and unforgettable. This was not a country simply fighting a war. This was a civilization forging the modern world in real time. When they looked upon America's power, its organization, its energy, its purpose, they weren't seeing just factories. They were looking at the future. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his famous speech in December 1940, he declared that America must become the great arsenal of democracy. Few could imagine how completely that vision would become reality. By the time German POWs were arriving on American soil, the United States had already unleashed the most powerful industrial surge in human history. Every state, every city, and every small town seemed to pulse with production. The factory became as vital as the battlefield. The same assembly lines that had once produced cars, refrigerators, and radios now turned out tanks, bombers, and bullets, in numbers so vast they seemed impossible. At the Ford Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, 42,000 workers labored around the clock to build the B-24 Liberator bomber. The factory stretched nearly a mile long, its own city under one roof. By 1944, it was producing one bomber every 63 minutes, an achievement unmatched in aviation history. Henry Ford's mass production techniques, born in peacetime for automobiles, now powered a nation at war for freedom. Nearby in Detroit, the Motor City became the Arsenal City. General Motors built tanks, engines, and aircraft parts. Chrysler produced the legendary M4 Sherman tank, and Ford added trucks, jeeps, and armored carriers to the rolling tide of American steel that crossed the Atlantic. By war's end, Detroit alone had manufactured more military vehicles than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. The German POWs assigned to labor near these plants saw something extraordinary. The workers were not driven by fear or propaganda, they were motivated by purpose. Men and women worked side by side. African Americans, Mexican Americans, and immigrants filled critical roles on the assembly lines. Freedom, not coercion, was the fuel. In California, Boeing's Seattle and Burbank plants turned the West Coast into a sky factory. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-29 Superfortress rolled out in formation from hangars so vast they had to be disguised with painted rooftops to confuse enemy reconnaissance. Across the country, the Douglas Aircraft Company produced more than 29,000 planes. North American Aviation built 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. Republic Aviation added 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts. Each of these machines represented thousands of hours of American labor, not from conscripts, but from volunteers. And then there was Rosie the Riveter. She became the symbol of America's wartime workforce, sleeves rolled, bandana tied, eyes fierce with purpose. By 1943, women made up nearly one-third of the entire manufacturing labor force, taking on roles that had once been unthinkable: welding, riveting, driving cranes, operating presses. They weren't just filling in, they were proving that determination and skill had no gender. One German POW, later interviewed after the war, said quietly, "We thought only slaves or prisoners worked like that. Then we learned they were free people, and proud of it." The scale of American output defied comprehension. Between 1941 and 1945, U.S. industry produced 324,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, 6.5 million tons of naval vessels, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. No other nation in history had ever matched such output. What made it more extraordinary was how decentralized it was. Thousands of small businesses joined the fight, converting local factories and workshops into miniature arsenals. A toy company in Ohio began making parts for fighter planes. A piano manufacturer in Pennsylvania built wooden gliders. Even car tire plants switched to producing rubber for gas masks and life rafts. America's genius wasn't just in scale, it was in adaptability. The morale in these factories rivaled the front lines. War bonds hung from bulletin boards. Lunchrooms displayed photos of sons and brothers serving overseas. Every rivet driven, every tank assembled, every plane that left the runway carried with it a piece of home, and the promise of victory. As production soared, so did pride. America had proven that democracy wasn't just an idea, it was an engine. And that engine ran faster, harder, and stronger than any dictatorship could ever imagine. By late 1944, even German engineers studying captured U.S. weapons began to realize a hard truth: America's advantage wasn't only in numbers, it was in momentum. A free society, once mobilized, had no limits. In the words of General George C. Marshall, the power of this country is overwhelming, and it is growing. And in factories from Michigan to California, that power had a sound: the thunder of presses, the hum of conveyors, the rhythm of freedom at work. For the German POWs who saw it firsthand, it wasn't humiliation they felt. It was revelation. They had seen the true face of American might, not through weapons on a battlefield, but through workers in a factory. A nation united by liberty had become the most unstoppable force on earth. By 1943, America had become a nation of workers in motion. Factories glowed through the night. Farms thundered with tractors. Railroads sang under the weight of tanks and trucks. In every corner of the country, ordinary men and women had transformed into something extraordinary, an industrial army powered by freedom. When President Roosevelt called for the arsenal of democracy, millions answered that call not with rifles, but with wrenches, welders, and work gloves. In the greatest labor mobilization in history, the United States shifted more than 16 million civilians into war production, and not through compulsion, but through conviction. The spirit of sacrifice. Posters reminded workers, the men behind the gun depends on you. Factories ran 24 hours a day, with shifts overlapping to keep the machines alive. Workers skipped holidays, gave up weekends, and tolerated rationing because they understood one simple truth: freedom had to be earned on the assembly line just as much as on the battlefield. The average factory worker earned modest wages but produced miracles. A woman riveting aircraft panels could help turn out a bomber every hour. A machinist in Pittsburgh could help forge tank armor that would cross the Rhine. An electrician in California could wire the B-29 that would fly over Tokyo. Each worker, no matter how small the task, became part of a single, unstoppable rhythm. The rise of Rosie and the power of inclusion. For many Americans, the war marked the first time they had ever worked outside their traditional roles. Over 6 million women entered the workforce, a revolution in social and economic life. They wore overalls, tied their hair in bandanas, and became icons of strength. The Rosie the Riveter campaign wasn't just propaganda, it was pride. It symbolized a nation that trusted its people, men and women alike, to deliver. Women built planes, tanks, ships, munitions, and uniforms. They managed supply lines and laboratories. For the first time, they were recognized not just as supporters of war, but as builders of victory. Equally powerful was the contribution of African American, Hispanic, Asian American, and Native American workers. Despite discrimination, they answered the call of duty in shipyards, steel mills, and foundries. At the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, Henry Kaiser hired thousands of Black and Mexican American workers. There, in record-breaking time, they produced Liberty ships that kept Britain alive and the Allies moving. A single yard could launch a fully operational cargo ship in less than 5 days, a feat that stunned both friends and enemies. Native Americans worked in aircraft plants and served as code talkers abroad. Chinese Americans welded submarines in Seattle. Italian and Polish immigrants packed into Midwest factories. The American dream was no longer a promise, it was a production line. The power of motivation. Unlike the forced labor of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, America's workforce was fueled by belief. They believed in family, in freedom, and in the idea that their sweat today would save lives tomorrow. Factory floors displayed photos of sons in uniform. Church bulletins listed production goals alongside prayer requests. Newspapers printed headlines celebrating record output, 300 planes in 1 week. Rubber drive surpasses goal. Every victory at the front began with victory at the workbench. Labor and leadership. Government agencies like the War Production Board coordinated resources, but it was the workers who delivered the results. When the U.S. auto industry halted civilian car production in 1942, not a single new car was sold to the public for 3 years. Instead, those factories produced tanks, trucks, and engines for the Allies. Detroit became the city that defeated Hitler. Pittsburgh, the forge of freedom. Los Angeles, the aviation capital of the world. No nation had ever retooled itself so completely, so quickly, or so successfully. A moral victory in labor. German POWs, working on nearby farms and observing the endless energy of American production, were stunned. One later recalled, "Your people worked as though every bolt and screw would win the war, and perhaps it did." They saw no coercion, only cooperation. The power of democracy was made visible in every shift, every assembly line, every exhausted smile. By 1945, the United States had employed over 18 million workers in war industries and produced more goods than all Axis powers combined. It wasn't just an industrial triumph, it was a human one. Freedom had found its most potent weapon, the American worker. By 1943, while the smoke of war darkened Europe and Asia, the fields of America glowed with abundance. Behind every bomber, every tank, and every rifle stood the quiet power of the American farm. It was a front line of its own, stretching across a continent. When German prisoners of war were sent inland to work, they were astonished by what they saw. There were no bombed villages, no starving crowds. Instead, there were tractors plowing endless rows of corn, grain elevators standing tall against the horizon, and families whose barns overflowed with harvest. In the ruins of Europe, food had become a weapon of survival. In America, it was proof of strength. At the start of the war, nearly a third of Americans still lived on farms. Many young men were drafted, but production did not falter, it surged. The government called for food for freedom, and the nation responded. Mechanization transformed the countryside. Tractors replaced horses, combines rolled through wheat fields, and new fertilizers multiplied yields. Electrification, a gift of the New Deal, reached thousands of rural homes for the first time, powering milking machines and irrigation pumps. By 1944, American farms were producing more than 120% of their pre-war output, with fewer hands to work the land. The numbers tell the story of a miracle. Milk, meat, corn, and wheat poured from the heartland in record quantities. Ships leaving New Orleans, New York, and San Francisco carried millions of tons of food to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and every Allied front. The Lend-Lease program made American produce as vital as its weapons. A British soldier biting into a loaf of bread in North Africa or a Russian infantryman eating canned beef on the Eastern Front was tasting the work of American soil. Across the nation, city dwellers joined the effort through victory gardens. Backyards, rooftops, and public parks were turned into miniature farms. By 1943, more than 20 million of these gardens supplied nearly 40% of all vegetables consumed in the United States. Housewives, students, and retirees harvested tomatoes, carrots, and beans for the family table while freeing commercial farmers to feed the troops. It was democracy in motion, each citizen contributing in his or her own way. Yet producing food was only half the challenge. Delivering it to the front was a triumph of logistics unmatched in human history. The Army Transportation Corps and the Merchant Marine coordinated an ocean-spanning web of trains, trucks, and ships. America's railroads moved 700 million tons of war material each year. Convoys of Liberty ships, built faster than any fleet before them, carried flour, fuel, and ammunition across the Atlantic. At home, gasoline and rubber were rationed so that soldiers overseas would never run short. Texas, Oklahoma, and California pumped the oil that fueled Allied planes and tanks, supplying more than 85% of all petroleum used by the Allies. Refineries turned crude into aviation gasoline, lubricants, and synthetic rubber that kept the war machine alive. For the German prisoners who labored in the countryside, this abundance was almost impossible to comprehend. They harvested crops beside American farmers, handled modern machinery, and ate well. One later said, "We thought America was rich because of its factories. Then we saw its farms and understood it was rich because of its people." The efficiency was not enforced by fear but inspired by freedom. Every worker believed in the cause. Every farmer felt that the sweat from his brow helped a soldier survive somewhere far away. By the end of 1945, America's farms had produced over 900 billion pounds of food, its oil fields had pumped more than 1.5 billion barrels of crude, and its transportation network had carried 2/3 of all the supplies consumed by Allied forces around the world. It was an achievement so vast that even today historians struggle to measure its full scope. The American home front had turned prosperity into purpose and freedom into fuel. When the trains carrying German prisoners passed endless miles of fertile land, they were looking at something more powerful than a weapon. They were seeing the engine of a civilization. The barns, silos, factories, and railways were all part of one great heartbeat, steady and unbreakable. America did not conquer through fear or empire. It conquered through cooperation, innovation, and belief. From the smallest garden to the largest refinery, every ounce of effort became part of the same promise: to feed, to fuel, and to free. And in that harmony of labor and liberty, the world caught a glimpse of what democracy could truly do. By 1944, the war had become a contest of endurance, and numbers told the story of power. In that contest, Northwest nation came close to the United States. America had turned mathematics into momentum. It did not just build weapons, it built systems, and those systems produced victory one machine, one shell, one ship at a time. At the start of the war, the United States was not yet the military giant it would become. Its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than that of Portugal. But within 4 years, through pure industrial energy, it had transformed itself into the greatest arsenal the world had ever known. By 1945, American factories had produced 324,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and nearly 6.5 million tons of naval vessels. The scale was staggering. While German industry was strangled by bombing and shortages, American output only increased. The United States produced almost half of all the war material used by the Allies. Britain, the Soviet Union, and China each relied on American supply lines for planes, trucks, and fuel. Lend-Lease shipments crossed every ocean. Jeeps and bombers for the British, locomotives and spam for the Soviets, trucks and rubber for the Chinese. When the Red Army rolled into Berlin in 1945, more than half its transport vehicles bore American names: Studebaker, Ford, GMC. A Soviet general later admitted, "Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would not have won the war." The numbers themselves tell a story of scale beyond imagination. The United States built one aircraft carrier every month, one destroyer every week, and one cargo ship every 3 days. At the height of production, the shipyards of Richmond, California, launched a Liberty ship in just 4 days, setting a record that still stands. The aircraft industry, which had produced 2,000 planes a year before the war, was turning out 96,000 annually by 1944. A single B-24 bomber contained more than 1.2 million parts, and every piece had to be designed, forged, and assembled in a network of factories spanning the continent. Yet somehow it worked perfectly. This achievement was not born from central command or fear of punishment. It came from coordination, planning, and the genius of free enterprise harnessed to national purpose. The War Production Board acted as the brain of the operation, ensuring that raw materials flowed where they were needed. Aluminum from Tennessee, steel from Pennsylvania, oil from Texas, copper from Montana, all converged in a symphony of supply. Railroads carried these materials around the clock, moving more freight in a single year than ever before or since. Economists later calculated that between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 40% of all munitions manufactured worldwide. The Axis powers combined accounted for less than 30%. Germany, even with its forced labor and total mobilization, could not compete with the productivity of a nation driven by freedom. For every tank Germany built, America built 5. For every plane Japan launched, America sent 10 into the sky. It was a war fought with numbers, and the arithmetic of democracy proved unbeatable. Yet the scale of production was only half the story. The efficiency behind it was equally astounding. The Ford Willow Run plant produced a bomber every hour, but it also pioneered modular assembly techniques that changed manufacturing forever. Factories shared blueprints across industries, from aircraft to kitchen appliances, creating a cross-pollination of ideas that would fuel the post-war boom. America's engineers and workers did not just build, they innovated while they built. To German prisoners who witnessed this from the edges, unloading rail cars, repairing fences near airfields, or watching trains rumble past, it was like observing another world. One POW recalled later, "You could hear America working, even at night." The trains never stopped. To them, the numbers were no longer abstract. They were real, passing by in endless freight cars, stamped with markings from Boeing, Ford, and Bethlehem Steel. Each car carried a small piece of victory. By the end of the war, America's gross national product had doubled. Its factories stood unbombed, its farms richer than ever, its people confident in what they had achieved. It had proven that democracy could not only defend itself but outperform every tyranny that challenged it. When the fighting finally ceased, German officers taken to ports and airfields for repatriation saw rows of new ships waiting, hangars filled with planes that had never even been used. The war, it seemed, had ended before America's strength had even peaked. They realized what the numbers meant, that no enemy could ever truly defeat a nation capable of building like this. In the end, the numbers were not just statistics, they were symbols of will. Every rivet, every crate, every bullet counted because it represented belief in work, in freedom, in a shared destiny. The math of victory was simple. America produced more, moved faster, and believed harder. And when the world added it all up, the sum was overwhelming. In every war, there is a material front and a moral one. The factories, the ships, the weapons, all of it depends on something invisible, spirit. In the 1940s, the United States discovered that the greatest weapon in its arsenal was not metal or machinery, but morale. The nation's unity, confidence, and shared purpose gave its industrial miracle meaning. The will to win became as real as the tanks that rolled off Detroit's assembly lines. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the shock was immediate and profound. But where other nations might have staggered, the United States organized. Within days, recruitment centers overflowed, assembly lines lengthened, and communities mobilized. There was no sense of despair, only determination. The radio brought Roosevelt's calm voice into living rooms, reminding citizens that, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." That phrase, first spoken during the Great Depression, became a spiritual engine during the war. Across the country, patriotism took a new shape, not in parades or speeches alone, but in daily work. People did not need to be forced to labor, they volunteered to contribute. Newspapers printed lists of production goals, towns held war work rallies, and churches prayed for factory shifts as they once prayed for rain. The American flag flew over workshops and barns. It wasn't propaganda that drove production, it was pride. Hollywood joined the effort, blending entertainment with encouragement. Movies like Casablanca, Mrs. Miniver, and Yankee Doodle Dandy stirred emotions and reinforced a sense of moral clarity. Stars toured factories, selling war bonds and reminding workers that what they made saved lives. More than 85 million Americans bought bonds, raising over $180 billion to finance the fight. The posters that covered city walls said it all. "We can do it, loose lips sink ships, do the job he left behind." They were not orders from above but invitations to believe. In schools, children collected scrap metal and rubber. Boy Scouts canvassed neighborhoods for aluminum pots that could be melted into aircraft parts. Housewives learned to stretch rations, not out of complaint but with creativity and purpose. Everyone had a role, and everyone knew it. That sense of belonging transformed sacrifice into honor. The strength of morale showed itself most clearly in the absence of fear. America had been attacked at Pearl Harbor, but its mainland remained untouched. Instead of succumbing to anxiety, the population turned fear into focus. Where dictatorships demanded obedience, democracy inspired enthusiasm. Workers did not sing hymns to a leader, they sang songs about their country, their families, their belief in freedom. Music, too, carried the message. Swing bands and crooners filled the airwaves with rhythm and reassurance. Songs like Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy and Praise the Lord and Pass the Ammunition turned the factory floor into a stage of resilience. Even on night shifts, the laughter and music never fully stopped. The sound of hammering metal mixed with radios playing Glenn Miller, a melody of freedom in motion. The government understood that morale was a strategic resource. The Office of War Information coordinated films, newsreels, and posters to maintain optimism without illusion. Americans knew the war was brutal, but they also believed it was just. Every broadcast from Edward R. Murrow in London, every photograph of a Marine in the Pacific, reminded them why they worked and fought. At home, communities became families. Neighbors shared ration coupons, watched one another's children, and gathered around radios to hear updates from distant fronts. Unity was not demanded, it was chosen. The war had created something profound, a sense that democracy itself was a collective effort. For the German prisoners who lived and labored within this environment, the atmosphere was baffling. They saw no despair, no fatigue that came from coercion. They saw ordinary citizens smiling after 12-hour shifts, proud of what they were building. One POW, later interviewed, said, "In Germany, we worked because we were told to. In America, they worked because they wanted to." That difference explained everything. By 1944, morale had become America's invisible advantage. It held the home front together, lifted soldiers overseas, and reassured allies that this was a fight that could and would be won. The belief that freedom was worth defending turned labor into inspiration and industry into destiny. When the war ended, observers tried to explain how the United States had achieved so much, so fast. The answer was simple but profound: a free people, united by purpose, can do anything. America's strength was not only in what it built but in what it believed. Factories could be copied. Machines could be captured. But morale, that deep, unbreakable faith in liberty, belonged to America alone. And in the end, that spirit fueled every engine, lifted every plane, and carried an entire world toward freedom. When the first trains carrying German prisoners rolled across America in 1943, the men inside looked through the windows with quiet disbelief. They had been told many things about the United States, that it was weak, decadent, divided. Yet the country they saw flashing past their train cars was nothing like that. Mile after mile of farmland stretched into the horizon, every acre cultivated, every road paved. Smoke rose from factories that never slept. It was not the America of propaganda posters. It was a nation in full stride, confident and unstoppable. Over 400,000 Axis prisoners, the vast majority German, would spend the final years of the war on American soil. They were scattered among 700 camps in 46 states, from the pine forests of Maine to the deserts of Arizona. Many were held in the heartland, near rail hubs and farmland, where their labor could relieve the wartime manpower shortage. They picked cotton in Texas, harvested sugar beets in Colorado, and baled hay in Nebraska. Under the Geneva Convention, they were paid a small wage, given clean clothes, and fed almost as well as American soldiers. To men who had come from bombed cities and collapsing supply lines, the experience bordered on surreal. For many, the first shock came from abundance. They saw warehouses filled with food, trucks rolling through towns loaded with fresh produce, and civilians eating meals that seemed extravagant by wartime European standards. One POW later admitted that he had expected to see soup lines and poverty. Instead, he saw diners with bright neon signs and stores full of goods. Even rationing in America, they realized, meant variety, coffee, sugar, gasoline, not hunger. The second shock came from freedom. They watched American guards joke, smoke, and treat them with courtesy. The discipline was firm but fair. A captured U-boat officer at a camp in Pennsylvania wrote in his diary, "Our guards do not hate us. They follow rules, they believe in something called democracy, and somehow it makes them stronger." In the evenings, the prisoners listened to American radio broadcasts filled with music and laughter. It was difficult for them to reconcile this easy confidence with the enemy their government had described as chaotic and soft. As the months passed, many German soldiers began to see America not through ideology, but through daily life. They saw black and white soldiers working side by side, women driving trucks, and towns where citizens argued about politics without fear. The diversity confused them, and then impressed them. A POW in Oklahoma later recalled, "At first we thought their system would never work. Then we realized it did work, because people believed in it." The camps themselves became small studies in democracy. Prisoners elected spokesmen, published newsletters, and sometimes held educational programs. American officers encouraged reading and even provided books about U.S. history and government. Some prisoners resisted, clinging to Nazi loyalty, but many grew curious. They read about Washington, Lincoln, and Roosevelt. They saw in America something their own nation had lost: freedom with discipline, power with compassion. There were moments of humanity that stayed with them for life. Farmers invited them to Christmas dinners. Children waved as they passed on trucks. A few POWs even returned to visit the families they had worked for after the war ended. What had begun as captivity became revelation. The men who had once fought to destroy democracy now witnessed its strength firsthand, not in speeches, but in action. Historians like Arnold Kramer and Ron Robin have documented hundreds of such accounts. The pattern is always the same: surprise, respect, and reflection. One prisoner at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, said decades later, "It was there that I learned what America really was, not what we had been told. I saw that a free people could fight harder than slaves." In subtle ways, the POW camps became classrooms of democracy. The prisoners learned English, studied civics, and listened to jazz. Some took correspondence courses from American universities. They discovered that the enemy they had feared was also capable of forgiveness and order. It was a realization that many carried back to Germany, and that quietly helped rebuild a democratic West Germany after 1945. For the Americans who guarded and employed them, the treatment of POWs was not just about law, it was about principle. They understood that the way they treated their enemies said something about the kind of nation they were defending. Fairness was its own propaganda, and it worked better than any leaflet dropped from the sky. By the time the last prisoners sailed home in 1946, thousands had changed their view of the world. They had seen a society that produced not through fear, but through cooperation, that valued law, decency, and dignity. They returned to a shattered Europe with memories of wide fields, fair treatment, and a nation humming with life. Many would tell their families that America's power was not just material, it was moral. In their journals and letters, a single theme repeats: respect. They had entered America as enemies but left as witnesses to something larger than victory. They had seen the strength of a free people, and it had changed them. The guns of war had silenced their armies, but it was the quiet, relentless order of American life, the confidence of a country certain of its purpose, that truly conquered them. If America's factories were the muscle of the war, its inventors and engineers were the mind. No nation in history had ever mobilized science and technology as completely as the United States did between 1941 and 1945. The speed of innovation was breathtaking. It wasn't just about producing more, it was about producing better, faster, and smarter. The country that once led in automobiles and consumer goods suddenly led the world in radar, aviation, logistics, and atomic science. When the war began, the United States was not the most technologically advanced nation. Germany had jet aircraft, advanced submarines, and the first ballistic missiles. But America had something even more powerful: an open system of collaboration between government, universities, and private industry. In that openness, ideas could move as freely as materials. The American way of innovation was rooted in trust, a belief that creativity multiplied when minds were allowed to compete, cooperate, and build without fear. Across the nation, new laboratories and research centers sprang up overnight. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology became the beating heart of radar development. Scientists there perfected microwave detection systems that could spot enemy planes and ships in darkness and fog. Radar would go on to save countless Allied lives, turning night skies from ambush zones into opportunities. In California, the engineers of North American Aviation and Lockheed redesigned the very concept of air combat. The P-51 Mustang, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, could escort bombers deep into Germany, changing the balance of the air war. The B-29 Superfortress, produced in secret and assembled with astonishing precision, carried more payload and flew higher and farther than any bomber before it. Its production required over 1 million individual parts and coordination across 4 states, a feat that only America's industrial web could achieve. Meanwhile, Bell Laboratories, RCA, and General Electric turned communications into a weapon. Advances in radio technology allowed for better coordination between units on land, sea, and air. American pilots could talk to ships hundreds of miles away. Field commanders could direct artillery with unprecedented accuracy. Information moved faster than the enemy could react. The age of modern electronic warfare had begun, and it was being written in American factories. Logistics, too, became a domain of innovation. The creation of standardized containers, portable bridges, and prefabricated structures like the Quonset hut revolutionized the way armies moved and lived. Engineers at the Army Corps designed pontoon bridges that could be deployed across rivers in hours. Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, built airstrips, ports, and bases across the Pacific, carving runways out of coral and jungle. The pace of construction matched the pace of combat. Fuel, the lifeblood of war, also received American ingenuity. Chemists at Standard Oil developed new high-octane aviation gasoline that gave Allied planes superior speed and range. Synthetic rubber, created to replace imports cut off by Japanese expansion, became another triumph of coordination. Within 2 years, the U.S. synthetic rubber industry grew from zero to producing over 800,000 tons annually. Even the packaging of rations, the design of helmets, and the insulation of wires benefited from breakthroughs in materials science. At the top of this pyramid of innovation stood the Manhattan Project, the most secret and ambitious scientific effort ever attempted. Begun in 1942 under General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, it brought together more than 130,000 scientists, engineers, and workers in facilities stretching from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge to Hanford. German intelligence never even learned the full scope of the project. In less than 3 years, it achieved the unimaginable, harnessing the energy of the atom. Whether one viewed it with awe or fear, it was proof of what a free society could accomplish when united by purpose. Even the German prisoners who worked near American bases or factories could sense this relentless creativity. They saw new types of trucks and aircraft appear every few months, new machines arriving on railcars before the old ones were even worn out. One POW who labored near a plant in Kansas said, "They were never finished improving. Every week something was faster, lighter, or stronger." To them, it was a revelation, innovation not driven by desperation, but by confidence. By 1945, American research had set the stage for the world to come. Jet engines, electronic computing, antibiotics, radar navigation, and nuclear energy all emerged from those war years. The same drive that built weapons for war would soon build tools for peace, televisions, transistors, passenger planes, and vaccines. It was the beginning of the modern world, and it had been forged in the laboratories and factories of a nation that believed in possibility. For the men who witnessed it, whether soldier, worker, or prisoner, the lesson was the same: freedom does not slow progress, it accelerates it. America had shown that innovation was not the privilege of the few, but the inheritance of the many. When the war ended, the machines would quiet, the laboratories would open their doors, and a new era would begin. But the memory of that furious creativity, of ideas moving faster than fear, would remain the clearest proof that America's true power lay not only in its strength, but in its imagination. The Second World War was fought on distant continents, but in America, every home became a small part of the battlefield. From the smallest village in Iowa to the tenements of New York City, the war reached into kitchens, classrooms, and corner stores. The entire nation moved in harmony, and for the first time in its history, nearly every citizen, soldier, worker, or child played a role in the same cause. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, it had not just mobilized an army, it had mobilized a civilization. The call to arms did not come only from Washington. It echoed through every street and every radio. Posters declared, "Do your part," and Americans took it literally. Families adjusted their lives to the rhythm of production, rationing, and service. The line between the home front and the front line disappeared. Ration books became symbols of participation. Gasoline, meat, sugar, and rubber were rationed to ensure the military never lacked supplies. Every household kept careful track of coupons, using them with pride, not resentment. Housewives learned to stretch ingredients, to bake with substitutes, to reuse and repair. The government encouraged conservation with slogans like, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." Across the nation, communities organized car-sharing programs and scrap drives. Children collected tin cans, paper, and old tires that would be melted and remade into weapons. The unity went beyond necessity, it became identity. The war created a sense of shared destiny that bridged class, region, and race, even as deep inequalities still lingered. In neighborhoods where people once barely spoke, they now worked together toward common goals. Churches ran blood drives. Schools taught students to recognize enemy aircraft silhouettes. Movie theaters played newsreels before every film, showing battles in Europe and the Pacific, and reminding audiences that their work, their taxes, their bonds made a difference. War bonds themselves became a national ritual. Celebrities traveled the country to rally crowds, urging Americans to invest in victory. In towns large and small, factories paused production for bond breaks. Children donated coins from their allowances, farmers pledged shares of their harvest profits. By the end of the war, more than 85 million Americans had purchased bonds, raising billions of dollars, the financial heartbeat of the Allied campaign. Women bore a special weight in this unity. While millions of men fought overseas, women filled their places at home and at work. They became the heads of households, the keepers of morale, and the stewards of stability. They wrote letters every week to soldiers, packed care boxes, and managed budgets in an era of shortages. Rosie the Riveter represented more than factory labor, she symbolized the endurance of American womanhood itself. Even leisure took on patriotic purpose. Baseball games opened with war bond announcements. Radio programs paused for updates from the front. Musicians toured military bases and hospitals. Every form of entertainment, every public event, carried the same message, "We're in this together." The line between culture and duty blurred until the two were indistinguishable. The government understood the moral importance of this unity. The Office of War Information shaped communication carefully, ensuring that Americans were told the truth about hardship but always reminded of hope. Photographers like Dorothea Lange and journalists like Ernie Pyle showed the human side of the war, not just heroism but effort, fatigue, and perseverance. These stories turned labor into pride. The worker welding a hull in Richmond or the mother rolling bandages in Cleveland could see herself reflected in the nation's story. For the German prisoners scattered across America, this spirit was impossible to ignore. Even from behind fences, they saw families wave at troop trains, civilians fill mailbags for soldiers, children marching in scrap drives with homemade flags. They had come from a society that demanded obedience. Here, they saw one that inspired cooperation. One later wrote, "The power of America was not just in its machines. It was in its people, every one of them seemed to believe they were fighting for something personal." That sense of shared belief created an atmosphere unlike any in the world. There were no bombed streets, no mass evacuations, no sense of despair, yet the seriousness of purpose was everywhere. Blackouts along the coasts were obeyed without complaint. The draft was accepted as duty, not punishment. Even in loss, there was resolve. Gold star flags hung quietly in windows, symbols of both grief and gratitude. By 1945, the United States had achieved total mobilization without ever sacrificing its democracy. Elections continued, newspapers criticized policy, and freedom of speech remained intact, yet the country functioned as a single organism, working toward one end. It was proof that liberty did not mean chaos, it could mean harmony. When victory finally came, Americans celebrated not only the end of the war but the triumph of unity. They had proven that a free society could discipline itself without fear, that millions could act as one without losing their individuality. For a brief, shining moment, the American home had become the world's strongest fortress. It was the quiet power of that unity, the shared labor, the songs, the sacrifices, that gave steel its strength and purpose its direction. And long after the guns fell silent, the memory of those years would remind every generation that freedom, when shared, is the mightiest force on earth. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world looked around and saw one nation standing taller than all the rest. The United States had not only won a war, it had reshaped history. Its factories were intact, its people confident, and its ideas proven beyond doubt. Freedom had outbuilt tyranny, and democracy had shown that it could be both compassionate and unstoppable. The German prisoners who returned home carried with them memories of a nation that fought with its hands, its heart, and its mind. They had seen abundance without arrogance, discipline without cruelty, and power without oppression. To them, America was not just a country, it was an idea made visible in steel, soil, and spirit. In the years that followed, the same assembly lines that forged bombers began building cars, refrigerators, and televisions. The scientists who split the atom unlocked new frontiers in medicine and energy. The workers who once built tanks now built the modern world. Out of the crucible of war rose an era of prosperity and innovation that would define the 20th century as the American century. This is the legacy of that time, the proof that freedom works, that unity creates strength, and that when Americans believe in a cause, nothing on earth can match their momentum. If you felt that pride, if you believe in the story of what free people can do when they stand together, hit like, share this story, and subscribe for more journeys into the history that built our world. Because the past still speaks, and America's story is far from over.